CBS News Colorado presents The Border Crossed Us. I'm Michelle Griego. Long before this was Colorado, this was Mexico. Some of our families have been here hundreds of years, including mine. My ancestors date to the 1770s. Landowners in the Southwest, until the end of the Mexican-American War, moved the border south. And the idea that the border crossed us is at the heart of El Movimiento, the Chicano movement. Denver was the focus of a pivotal turning point from the mid-60s to the mid-70s, and for many, it started right here at West High School. March 20th, 1969, Sunken Gardens across from West High School was filled with young people, parents, and signs demanding fair treatment.
That's where the youth were finally taking a stance. They're like, we want access to our history. We don't want to be treated this way in school.
At the time, students were reprimanded if they spoke Spanish, and one teacher in particular intentionally mispronounced students' names and publicly humiliated them.
And he told them the reason the Mexicanos are stupid is because their parents are stupid and their grandparents are stupid. And if you eat Mexican food, you're going to look like a Mexican. So the students went to the principal, and they told them what happened. They wanted him fired. Well, the principal didn't do anything. So they went to their parents, and the parents and the students went to the principal, and he still didn't do anything.
They organized a walkout and created a list of demands.
But one of the interesting ones is that they asked for Chicano food to be served in the cafeteria, because that's what he said. Okay, you're going to look like a Mexican if you eat Mexican food.
But mostly, they wanted the teacher fired, bilingual education, and Chicano literature in the school library.
Say, okay, we got to go back and learn our history. We have to go back and be proud of our indigenous roots and our Mexican roots.
A couple hundred marched to Baker Junior High to gather more students. When they returned to West, police in riot gear were waiting.
We were young, so we were moving. And
Rudy Gonzalez was a fifth grader when his dad, Rodolfo Corky Gonzalez, a Chicano activist and founder of Crusade for Justice, took him out of school to go to the walkouts.
This was probably the most revolutionary act that this city had ever seen by young people, by Chicanos and Chicanas, and young people of color.
His sister Nita was also there and picked up a bullhorn.
Well, we were all bunched up there, and they began to push. They began to come in from the east and push against us, and then the adults were down on the street in front, and they began to see the police beginning to pull us and beat some of the leadership, and they jumped in to try to defend and protect us.
The police used so much tear gas that they had to call for tear gas from other police departments in the area.
The blowouts lasted for 4 days. 6 people were hurt, 26 police cars were destroyed, and 45 people got arrested.
People knew Denver was to be taken serious in its efforts and work in the Chicano movement. A white police force, a Chicano and black demonstration of young people who had the temerity, the audacity to stand up for their rights by God.
Students here were fighting to know their history. Standing up against injustice in their classrooms, they embraced their heritage. That's the true meaning and the essence of being Chicano. And Chicano history is American history.
When a lot of Chicanos say we didn't cross the border crossed us, what that means is there's actually generations that were here, almost 400 years.
And one generation lived in the Spanish Empire, then Mexico, then the United States. On February 2, 1848, the U.S. and Republic of Mexico signed the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, ending the Mexican-American War. Mexico would cede 55% of its land to the U.S., making up the southwestern United States. Moving the border instantly changed the lives of nearly 80,000 Mexican citizens living in the area.
There were families and people living in these communities, and they essentially told them, you can either become a United States citizen or you can go to Mexico. Of course, a lot of these families have been living there for hundreds of years already, so they stayed.
The treaty promised to protect them and their land, but when the treaty went to Congress, the Senate took out the provision protecting land grants. Mexican, now U.S. citizens, lost their land and wealth, and English was required to settle any land disputes.
Everything was in English, and it was very intentional.
Many Mexican Americans lived on communal land grants that included individual family plots and communal grazing, hunting, and gathering lands. Many of these grants were broken up after the treaty. Even when the territorial legislature was established, there were Mexican Americans invited to participate. But there were no interpreters, so they couldn't read any bills. So when Colorado became a state in 1876, Casimiro Varela, shown in one of 16 stained glass portraits hanging inside the state capitol, fought to make sure the state constitution was published in English, Spanish, and German. Activists would eventually regain access to 77,000 acres in the San Luis Valley, the oldest settlement in Colorado, in 2002, more than 150 years after the treaty. That wouldn't be the last time Mexican Americans would be displaced. Coming up, how the trauma from the border crossing us impacts our community more than 100 years later. The 1960s was a tumultuous decade in the U.S., a time of war, protest, and national tragedies. The Black Civil Rights Movement heated up, the Women's Liberation Movement began, and Chicanos were protesting for equality, education, and better wages. Colorado was no different. Denver, including here at La Raza Park, became the site of many protests, walkouts, strikes, and cultural events that would challenge the status quo and raise awareness.
Discrimination became more prevalent, like these signs that we had in the restaurant that said no Mexicans or dogs allowed, okay? So people were starting to see, hey, well, why are we putting up with all this crap?
Chicanos were tired of mistreatment. On Denver's west side, tensions were continuing to rise between Chicanos and law enforcement.
We always knew that our relationship with the police was not there to serve and protect us. It was that if you got caught in the wrong place or if you were doing the wrong thing, the bad things could happen to you. And our parents just told us, just get out of the way, get back home.
Tensions were also building at the Kitayama Carnation Farm in Brighton, where workers would clash with police. In 1968, mostly female workers started speaking up against long hours and no overtime pay and bad working conditions that led to health problems.
90 cents an hour and treated like that, it is not right.
New employee Guadalupe Villalobos Briseño urged other workers to talk to the owner, Ray Kitayama.
Right away he said, you all people came to see me about the job, but you are all a bunch of pigs. Those plain words like that. You know, it just clicks in your mind that cannot tolerate these things.
So they started talking about forming a union.
Next morning we show up, everybody show up to work. And there was all kinds of policemen there. Some women are vomited, they're crying, they're upset, just because they see the police.
Guadalupe was fired, but still organized a strike that would last 8 months. Their last-ditch effort was chaining themselves to the front gate. Police showed up with tear gas.
You're choking, you're crying, you don't know in what mess you got into it. All that suddenly, they're all over you. These policemen are spraying you with tear gas. That you cannot get away because you're chained up.
This small fight, led by women, got a lot of support, including from Cesar Chavez in California, giving them permission to use the huelga, the symbol of the United Farm Workers strike, and Corky Gonzalez, nicknamed Corky by his uncle, who said he was always popping off like a cork. He gained a lot of popularity in the Denver boxing world and was the first Chicano athlete in the Colorado Sports Hall of Fame. But his words had a more powerful punch than his fists.
Dad was a very controversial figure, as most people are, who take the road of struggle, loved and hated.
Corky organized a march for equity and justice called Crusade for Justice. That became the name of his organization in 1965. His epic poem, Yo Soy Joaquin, can still be found on Chicano murals today. It tells the story of Joaquin, who travels through history, beginning as an Aztec, then as a Mexican, and finally as a Chicano in the U.S.
It's a telling of our story in words that we understand for the first time. By understand, it's bilingual. It goes back between the two cultures that we were balancing ourselves in, and it places us in history.
Months after the Carnation Strike and days after the West High blowouts, the Chicano Youth Liberation Conference was held in Denver, which brought together more than 1,500 activists, students, workers, and artists from across the country. This is where El Plan Espiritual de Aztlán was formed, the manifesto of the Chicano movement, identifying Chicano identity and vision.
It's defiance and resistance to injustice, to inequity. And for me, Chicano is a way to embrace my indigenous roots to this hemisphere. That we didn't cross the border, border crossed us.
That defiance would be crucial in the next decade. Coming up, where the border continued to cross a Denver neighborhood. In the 1880s, the state saw a wave of migration from New Mexico. Many Mexican Americans settled here at Auraria, Denver's oldest neighborhood. It became a vibrant home to so many people who already felt disenfranchised, but they were uprooted again, fighting to stay in their homes. Auraria became the soul of the Mexican American community in the early 1900s.
It was very vibrant. St. Cajetan's, that was like the cultural hub where there was baptisms there, weddings, but also it was a child care facility. It was a health care facility because at that time, all the way up until the 70s, people did not have access to just basic health care.
Even though it was the center of the Latino community, it was a red line neighborhood.
Redlining these communities allowed the city at any time to take control. And that's exactly what happened.
Redlining began in the 1940s throughout the U.S. The courts would determine the neighborhood high risk. That would allow the banks to deny loans based on the high-risk status, usually in urban areas where people of color lived.
So they literally just drew a line around these neighborhoods, and a bank had access to these maps, and they had like this color coding system, which red line meant they were high risk. They would say something like large population of Mexicans, large population of Jews. They didn't have access to buy the house because they didn't have access to mortgages at banks because they consider them high risk areas. And it was very intentional.
After a devastating flood in 1965, there were plans to redevelop the neighborhood into an urban college campus.
Hundreds of families were forced to leave overnight. They got a letter on their door and said, you have to leave.
Just across Colfax, a lot of families were forced to move into the city-sponsored housing projects in today's Lincoln Park neighborhood.
There were protests, there was a lot of organizing.
Father Pete Garcia at St. Cajetan's organized the Auraria Residents Organization to resist the displacement of families, but they were eventually defeated. Relocations were completed by 1972. The Auraria campus was finished in 1976. On other college campuses in the 70s, Chicano students started forming groups like UMAS, United Mexican American Students. At CU Boulder, they protested when hundreds of minority students did not receive their financial aid checks. The protests led to the occupation of an office building on campus for 19 days. Then the protest turned deadly. 6 Chicano activists, now known and commemorated on the CU campus as Los Seis de Boulder, or the Boulder Six, were killed in 1974 in 2 car bombings. That kind of violence led to many Chicano organizations disbanding. But the movement did not end. Coming up, the vibrant way the fight continues. The legacy of the Chicano movement continues today with the work of organizations like Servicios de la Raza and Cultivando.
The movement is alive and well in our many diverse leaders that are actively involved in ensuring that our community is not being treated inequitably and our community is being educated and informed about their ability and their power to assert themselves.
6 Latinas were elected to Denver City Council this year, making history and continuing the work of so many before them, like Rich Castro, Polly Baca, former Lieutenant Governor Joe Garcia, and Denver's first Latino mayor, Federico Peña, elected in 1983.
We talk about, yeah, we've got great politicians and we've got great artists and we've got great musicians. All of that is terrific. But the foundation of our country is really being built by the Latino community. And in the future, we are the new mainstream economy of the United States.
the economic power can't be denied.
The gross domestic product of all the Latinos in the United States is the 8th largest in the world. Our gross domestic product is bigger than countries around the world.
The Chicano movement left its mark all across Colorado in education, politics, and the arts, and you can really feel it here on Santa Fe Drive. For more than 50 years, Su Teatro has told the stories of Denver's Chicano community.
The first story I wrote about our community was about the West Side neighborhood. And I saw boarded up houses, and I saw empty houses, and I saw neighbors just kind of surviving in there. And I felt like I was watching ghosts. It was very painful and it was overwhelming, and I came in and I talked to the group and I said, I want to do this.
The group was a theater class at the University of Colorado at Denver, the beginning of Su Teatro in 1972.
I picked up my guitar and I sang, Aquí vivimos en el barrio de West Denver, los vecinos están como compadres. And that became the theme for the corrido, the telling of the story.
Away from the war in my country.
When you're in your land and somebody comes and pushes you out of your land and you become an immigrant in your own land, that's our story.
Murals are also telling that story.
For the very first time, you're starting to see the history of the communities painted on walls. And they're not just any wall.
This wall at La Alma Park was used by muralist Emmanuel Martinez as a reminder when people of color didn't have access to the pool there.
People of color could not swim in the pools until the day before the pool was going to be cleaned. They didn't have access to the park, the swimming pools, and it was in their community.
It's the community coming together that makes change. In 2019, 50 years after the West High blowouts, a state bill passed adding the history and contributions of minority groups, including Latinos, into public school classrooms.
Because if you don't know where you're coming from, you don't know where you are and you don't know where you're going.
We are a great people who have much to contribute, who have an incredible, beautiful past, and a great present and an amazing future. But it's only if we make it that way.
It's impossible to share all the history and contributions of Chicanos in the United States in such a short amount of time. But CBS News Colorado is committed to telling these stories of struggle and triumph and how La Lucha Sigue. The fight continues more than 125 years after the border crossed us.